Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for coming, and obviously my thanks to Dominic and Roll for putting this program together and for inviting me to participate. A quick note on the handout that's gone round. As you will have noticed, it's scarily long. Luckily, it's not necessary to use. Everything that you're going to need to follow along and everything that I'm going to discuss in detail will be on the PowerPoint, but just the handout is really just there if you want to go into a bit more detail or if you want to have a look at the original text and stuff like that. So no need to follow along with that if you don't want to. So as Dominic said, I'm going to talk today about the way that early Christians wrote about war. I've decided to be quite inclusive in terms of themes, as we'll see. And in order to facilitate that, I've restricted myself chronologically really to pre-Constantinian authors. So apologies for those of you who are expecting something proper late antiquity. That's partly a practical choice, as that's the material that I work on. But I think it also has an intellectual value in the sense that all of these authors that we'll be looking at today were writing in a time where Christianity was a minority religion and Christians were very much kind of excluded from the corridors of power, as it were, in the Roman world. And we'll see that that very materially affects the way that they write about the army, about war, and about warfare. So bearing in mind these chronological constraints, I see essentially three ways of thinking about this issue, and I'm going to try and tackle each of them today. Firstly, the area which has probably elicited the most scholarly interest is the early Christian attitude to military service, whether Christians can serve in the Roman army, what the problems with service are, etc. The second theme is early Christian description of wars that happened in or to the Roman Empire. And then kind of leaving the world of realia behind us slightly, the third way of looking at this issue is through the very common motif in early Christian literature of spiritual warfare, which inevitably draws images from actual warfare, and the related imagery of the soldier of Christ, the Miles Christi, which some of our authors are very enthusiastic about. These approaches are all quite different, but I'm going to focus on some similarities to suggest the ways in which people in antiquity wrote about warfare. In particular, I aim to show that perhaps the question, why do people write about war, which I think we've been thinking about over the last few weeks a bit, might be slightly the wrong way to think about this material. War, though a common topic, as we'll see, is almost never the focus of a text. War is always emotive material that's marshaled in the service of some other purpose, usually identity construction. So, first section, early Christians and military service. So what did early Christians think about the Roman army and about military service, and why? At various points in the 20th century especially, these questions have been given great importance, particularly in the interwar period. Scholars of various backgrounds are very interested in early Christian pacifism. And we'll start by looking at the text. So firstly, there's no explicit engagement with the issue of military service in the New Testament, but rather ambiguous material which could later be mobilized by both camps. Jesus himself never engages in violence against another person, obviously, but Matthew's Jesus utters the famous phrase, "All those who take the sword shall die by the sword," which he's added to Mark's description of one of those with Jesus striking the ear off one of the chief priest's slaves. Meanwhile, in Mark, Matthew, and John, the Roman cohort in Jerusalem is negatively characterized as mocking Jesus, and Jesus expels the multitude of demons known as Legion in the exorcism at Gerasene, which is often taken as an anti-military statement. On the other side, Luke and Matthew positively characterize two Roman soldiers, the centurion at Capernaum with a sick slave and the centurion at the cross. And in Acts of the Apostles, Luke extends his interest in positively characterized Roman soldiers. The most relevant for us is Cornelius the centurion, who's presented as a pious Judaizer and the first Gentile convert to Christianity after being told by an angel to seek out Peter. So as far as the New Testament is concerned, we can say that although the inventive exegete can find support for either position if they look hard enough, military service in the Roman army was beyond the intellectual horizons of the New Testament authors. And this is really the story until the end of the 2nd century. It's not a problem Christian authors felt the need to engage with, likely simply due to how small the Christian population was at the time. It's Tertullian who gives us our first sustained engagement with the problem of military service from a Christian perspective. Tertullian is the first Christian author in Latin whose name is known, and he wrote between the end of the 2nd century and the first few decades of the 3rd century, so under the Severans in Carthage. He's left us both texts which were ostensibly addressed to non-Christians, his apologies, as well as writings that have more the character of sermons addressed explicitly to Christian believers in his Carthaginian community, about which we know almost nothing. In his texts written explicitly to Christians, he emphatically rejects the possibility of Christian service. In his On Idolatry, which is written probably around 208 AD, Tertullian outlaws a plethora of occupations and everyday activities for his listeners. After making it clear that a Christian cannot perform duties as a Roman magistrate due to the compulsory involvement in religious ceremonies and the requirement to wear idolatrous clothing, Tertullian goes on to treat the military question. It can be seen that in the last chapter, prohibition was also given concerning the military service for those ranks which are between dignity and power. So he's referring there to the officers. But now this point is sought, whether a believer may turn himself over to the military service, or whether soldiers may be admitted to the faith, even with regards to the foot soldiers and other inferior grades, to whom there is no necessity of sacrificing or carrying out the capital punishment. There is no communion between the divine sacrament and the human sacrament, between the sign of Christ and the sign of the devil, between the camp of light and the camp of darkness. One soul cannot be given to two masters, God and Caesar. So Tertullian here says that officers are included by default in his previous arguments about Christians holding magistracies because they too must perform sacrifices. He then goes on to the rank and file, arguing that both for soldiers who become Christian and for Christians who wish to join the army, service is outlawed, since there is no communion between the divine sacrament and the human sacrament. The word Tertullian uses here for sacrament, that's translated as sacrament, is sacramentum, which is the technical term for the oath of allegiance which Roman soldiers swore. In Christian usage, however, and certainly depending on the military term, sacramentum means baptism, the point at which a Christian soul is pledged to God. For Tertullian, if the soldier's oath entails pledging complete loyalty to the emperor, then it's incompatible with baptism and constitutes split loyalty. And for Tertullian, any hint of split loyalty is tantamount to idolatry. Immediately following this, Tertullian acknowledges that some contemporary Christians argue in favor of military service by reference to Old Testament military figures. To counter this, he acknowledges that while there are some soldiers in the New Testament, and we briefly explored them, when Jesus disarmed Peter on the eve of his arrest, he also disarmed every soldier. Tertullian here is referring to Matthew's live by the sword, die by the sword, saying, but in order for him to make this point that Jesus disarmed all soldiers, Tertullian is forced to ignore the soldiers who are present in the biblical narrative after this point, in particular Cornelius, the good centurion, whom Peter himself baptizes in Acts of the Apostles. A few years later, in 211, Tertullian treats the same issue again On the Military Crown. This whole treatise was in fact motivated by a military episode. A man who was serving in the army, who was a Christian, refused to wear a crown, probably some kind of laurel wreath at a ceremony. Tertullian deals with the issue of service here too, and runs over much of the same arguments that he used On Idolatry. It's wrong to place the human sacrament above the divine. Those who use the sword will die by it. Soldiers must partake in idolatrous ceremonies, etc. But because this whole treatise was occasioned by a Christian soldier, he's forced to make a distinction here between Christians who join the service and those who are already serving when they become Christian, a distinction he explicitly denied On Idolatry. So here he's able to acknowledge the example of Cornelius the centurion, whom he had to ignore On Idolatry, as an example of a man who balanced faith and service. Clearly, those whom already serving the faith thereafter finds are in a separate condition, like those of John admitted to the the very faithful centurion whom Christ approved, and the centurion whom Peter catechized. So here Tertullian has to rhetorically pitch the problem slightly differently, because he has to allow for the possibility that there are good Christians serving as soldiers. So we begin to see, and we'll see this more and more as we go through the material, a certain rhetorical malleability, which only becomes more evident, which begins to suggest for us that these statements have purposes beyond themselves and are not necessarily essential truths. They're not concrete statements. And at least for Tertullian, the motivating factor in his opposition to military service was his abhorrence of idolatry. Origen is another pre-Constantinian Christian author whose views on enlistment have garnered attention. Origen was writing in the 240s in Alexandria, and in temperament and philosophical outlook, he's the polar opposite of Tertullian. It's interesting, though, that when it comes to military service, he reveals some similarity of attitude. Responding to Celsus, who is an Epicurean philosopher who wrote a treatise against the Christians, which survives now only through Origen's reply, Origen refutes an extensive list of accusations and misconceptions about Christianity. One of the accusations that Celsus appears to have made is that Christians do not do their bit in support of the empire, including fighting. Quoted by Origen, Celsus says, "If everyone were to do the same as you, there would be nothing to prevent the emperor from being abandoned, alone and deserted, while earthly things would come into the power of the most lawless and savage barbarians." In another fragment, again by Origen, he exhorts Christians to help the emperor with all of your power and cooperate with him in what is right, and fight for him and be fellow soldiers if he presses for this, and fellow generals with him. Origen strikingly doesn't deny the implication here that Christians don't serve. Rather, he argues that if the barbarians were also converted to Christianity, there would be no need to fight them, and also that Christians do not need to fight since they render a divine help to the emperor. We'll return to Origen's descriptions of spiritual warfare later, but for now it's enough to note that he's more than happy to let Celsus's insinuation that Christians do not serve in the army stand without correction. As Alan Creeder has noted, church orders as a genre tend to take a hard line against military service. So church orders, these are kind of rules and regulations for ecclesiastical communities. The early 3rd century apostolic tradition, composed in Rome and traditionally ascribed to the Roman bishop Hippolytus, commands that a soldier under authority must not be told to kill people. If he is ordered to do so, he shall not carry it out. If he will not agree, he should be rejected. If a catechumen or a believer wishes to become a soldier, they should be rejected, for they have despised God. Similarly, the canons of Hippolytus, ascribed even more tendentiously to the same bishop, but perhaps written much later in the 4th or maybe 5th century, lays down similar injunctions. Another group of texts which are of interest are the martyr narratives concerning soldiers. For those of you who aren't familiar, these documents purport to be trial records of Christians being persecuted. How closely they are related to real court documents is an open question, and there's clearly been at least some editing going on. Among the military martyrdoms are the Acts of Maximilian, which we'll just take a quick look at here. Maximilian has been described by several scholars pushing the pacifist line as history's first conscientious objector. The text states that in 295, Maximilian was presented for conscription. However, when the African proconsul overseeing proceedings asks for his name, Maximilian responds, "Why do you wish to know my name? I cannot serve because I am a Christian." The proconsul continues with the process of enrolling the conscript, telling him, "Serve or you will die." Now, most commentators seem to take it that Maximilian's opposition is based on doctrinal nonviolence. But Maximilian doesn't say, "I cannot kill," but "I cannot militare," I cannot serve as a soldier. And it's when Maximilian is ordered to be given the military seal, the signaculum, an impress-led ring, a little bit like a modern soldier's dog tag that represents the soldier's entry into service, that he gives his fuller reasoning. "I will not accept the seal. I already have the seal of Christ, who is my God. Jam habeo signum Christi Dei me." He goes on, "I will not accept the seal of this world, the signaculum saeculi. I am a Christian. I cannot wear a piece of lead around my neck after I have received the saving sign of Jesus Christ, my Lord, the Son of the living God. This is the only explanation Maximilian gives for his refusal to serve. And we see that for him, the signaculum, the military seal, functions in much the same way as the sacramentum did for Tertullian. It signifies loyalty to an earthly power that is due only to God, to the degree that Maximilian contrasts the signaculum saeculi, the seal of the world, with the signum Christi, the sign of Christ, just as Tertullian contrasted the sacramentum humanum and the sacramentum divinum. The Acts of Maximilian sits very much in the North African Latin Christian tradition, of which Tertullian was such an important early figure. So it's likely that there is a direct, perhaps even a direct literary relationship here. But either way, Maximilian's staunch opposition to military service is based on split loyalty. Again, an issue of idolatry, not pacifism or non-violence. Right at the end of our period, Lactantius in his Divine Institutes formulates what is probably the closest statement which amounts to a rejection of military service on purely non-violent grounds. When God forbids us to kill, he not only prohibits us from open violence, murder, etc., but he warns us against the commission of those things which are esteemed lawful among men. Thus it will be neither lawful for a just man to engage in warfare, since his warfare is justice itself, nor to accuse anyone of a capital charge. At another point, he quotes Ennius's Scipio and addresses Scipio Africanus himself. Oh, how great the darkness in which you were involved, Africanus, in that you imagined the ascent to heaven to be open to men through slaughter and bloodshed. This principled stand is not maintained in Lactantius's later post-Constantinian work on the deaths of the persecutors, which glories not only in the military victory of Constantine, but also in the grisly deaths of emperors such as Galerius. What's interesting, though, is that despite the opposition of these sources to military service, despite the picture that they want to paint, all, or most of them at least, are aware of Christian soldiers. Tertullian, indeed, boasts of the presence of Christians in the army in his Apology. We appeared only yesterday, and today we fill all your places, cities, islands, forts, towns, marketplaces, the camps themselves, castra ipsa. And elsewhere he says, we sail with you, we fight with you, militamus, we till the land with you, we partake in your commerce and your arts. So these are texts that are ostensibly addressed to Roman magistrates. And indeed, Tertullian also knows of a story that Christian soldiers fought with Marcus Aurelius, which we'll deal with in more detail in the next section. His On the Crown, as we've seen, wouldn't work without the fact of Christian service. Again, it's predicated on the fact that there was a Christian soldier who refused to partake in a religious ceremony. The same goes for the Acts of the military martyrs. And in fact, in the Acts of Maximilian, the exasperated proconsul snaps at the recalcitrant conscript. There are Christian soldiers in the sacred comitatus of our lords Diocletian and Maximian, Constantius and Maximus, and they serve. Despite Lactantius' stand against Christian serving, which we saw above, in his later On the Deaths of the Persecutors, he narrates as an injustice the first blow of the so-called Great Persecution, which was the expulsion of Christian soldiers from the Roman army. So 3 points to make from all of this material. First, these authors were describing a world that they wanted to see, not one which existed. They were world-creating texts that had in mind the construction of a Christian identity defined against the wider Greco-Roman world. Secondly, the rationale for the rejection of service was varied, but generally was more concerned with the dangers of idolatry than with violence per se. The problem was with this specific army, not with the principle of soldiering. And finally, linked to both of these points, we see the extreme rhetorical malleability of the positions taken. Authors weren't trying to create the same world with each text, nor even with each passage. Seen in this way, there's no actual conflict between Tertullian's rejection of military service in his sermons and his boasting of Christian soldiers in the Apology. Neither one can be said to be his true opinion. They're both different worlds to suit different needs. This explains too why a genre such as the church orders is so hostile to military service. The world that these texts want to create is of a fully self-sufficient, contained and regulated ecclesiastical society. Obviously a myth, but at the same time a myth that has no space or no need for soldiers. Apologetic texts, meanwhile, those addressed to outsiders, even if they were probably not in fact read by outsiders, create a world in which Christians are an integral part of the universe they inhabit, as full participants in Roman social relations. To draw out a mini conclusion from this section, we can say that attitudes to warfare and the army are highly contextual and are often at the service of larger, fundamentally political identity concerns. So moving on to the second section. Given this apparent disavowal of warfare, it's interesting to see how easily Christian thinkers were able to fit wars which did happen into essentially theological schema. So we'll start actually with the absence of war. Many scholars have commented on the fact that despite the Roman Empire's reputation for having attempted to quell Christianity, it's impossible to imagine the religion growing as it did without the unity, circulation, and the relative absence of warfare that the Roman Empire provided. And this was in fact appreciated by ancient Christians too. So Melito of Sardis, who's a 2nd century apologist whose works now only survive as fragments in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, seems to have articulated this first, saying that our philosophy first grew up among the barbarians, but its full flower came among your nation in the great reign of your ancestor Augustus. And from that time, the power of the Romans became great and splendid. So Melito here is associating the Pax Augusta with Christianity and interpreting Roman stability almost as a divine consequence of Christianity's entry into the world. Origen puts things a bit more explicitly. God was preparing the nations for his teaching, that they might be under one Roman emperor, so that the unfriendly attitude of the nations to one another, caused by the existence of a large number of kingdoms, might not make it more difficult for Jesus' apostles to do what he commanded them. It would have hindered Jesus' teaching from being spread through the whole world if there had been many kingdoms, because men everywhere would have been compelled to do military service and to fight in defense of their own land. This used to happen before the times of Augustus, when a war was necessary, such as between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. Eusebius was clearly influenced by this in turn, having been a keen student of both Melito and Origen. In his preparation for the gospel, I'll just praise you this, he says, whereas of old, in each nation, numberless kings and local governors held power, and hence wars of all kinds naturally arose, nations clashing against nations. When Augustus became sole ruler at the time of our Saviour's appearance, all of this ended. And from that time to the present, you cannot see, as before, cities at war with cities, nor nation fighting with nation. This especially I consider to be a very great proof of the divine and irresistible power of our Saviour. So if Roman peace can very easily be integrated into these schema, what about the wars which inevitably did occur in the Roman Empire? One strategy, perhaps dependent on instances in the Hebrew Bible where God acts militarily through Gentile nations, was to interpret Roman victories as an expression of divine will or even divine punishment. This theme is obliquely raised in the Gospels, all of which were written in the knowledge of the Jewish war. Whether or not Mark was written after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem or just during the siege, each Gospel looks forward with varying degrees of specificity to the Roman crushing of the Jewish rebellion as a fulfillment of Jesus' preaching against the iniquity of Second Temple Judaism and as recompense for Israel's failure to recognize the Messiah. Origen again makes this point explicitly, showing us a spiritualizing tendency in the interpretation of historical warfare. He writes, again responding to Celsus, Celsus goes on to say that those who killed Jesus suffered nothing for a long time afterwards. We must inform him and all who are prone to learn the truth. The Jewish people called for the crucifixion of Jesus. The city where all these things happened was attacked shortly after this. After a long siege, it was totally overthrown and destroyed. All this happened to them because the blood of Jesus was shed at their instigation and on their land. The Second Jewish War, the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba under Hadrian in the 130s, which ended with Jerusalem razed again, a new Roman colony planted in its place, and Jews banned from the Holy City, was used in a similar way. Justin Martyr, an important apologist from the mid-2nd century, while justifying Christian non-observance of the old law, tells his Jewish interlocutor in the dialogue with Trypho that circumcision was instigated to mark the Jewish people out so that God could destroy them in the Bar Kokhba revolt. He says, "The custom of circumcising the flesh was given to you as a distinguishing mark, to set you off from the other nations and from us Christians. The purpose of this was that you, and only you, might suffer the afflictions that are now justly yours, that only your land be desolate, and your cities ruined by fire, that not one of you be permitted to enter Jerusalem. This has been earned because you murdered the just one." It's worth noting too that in the opening of this text, Trypho, Justin's Jewish interlocutor, is presented as a refugee from that very war. 50 years later, certainly in literary dialogue with Justin, Tertullian makes a similar point in his work against the Jews, using it as evidence that Jesus must have been the Messiah, because how could the prophets have been referring to anyone else yet to appear if the Jews are now banned from Judea? The Christian acceptance of the Pax Augusta should clue us in to another way in which Christians accepted the contemporary state of violence in the Roman world. While the relative stability of the Roman world did mean less violence for the inhabitants of the empire, the flip side of this, an acknowledged, even valorized flip side, was the massive violence executed with regularity in the empire's border zones and beyond on Rome's barbarian neighbors. No Christian questioned the necessity of Roman operations against barbarians, and indeed they even participated in the enterprise of manufacturing honor and glory from warfare which occurred in the right places. One episode is particularly instructive. In the early 170s, Marcus Aurelius was campaigning against the Marcomanni and the Quadi north of the Danube. In 172, a Roman army was deep inside Quadi territory, parched due to lack of rainfall and supplies, and was on the edge of exhaustion, when it was surrounded by a superior German force and faced certain destruction. Suddenly, however, the skies burst and a great rain refreshed the Roman troops as thunderbolts scattered the terrified barbarians. The Germans were routed and the Roman force saved. We see a depiction of this event on panel 16 of Marcus Aurelius's column, with an unidentified rain deity stretching out his cloud-like arms over the Roman forces. Cassius Dio, in a passage that survives only as an epitome by the Byzantine scholar Xiphilinus, says that there was a story that an Egyptian magician was a companion with Marcus, and that he was able to coax the heavens into saving the Roman troops. Already within a decade of this event, however, Christians were claiming it for themselves. Apollinaris, a Christian apologist who was writing before 180 AD, so within a decade of the event, seems to have been the first. His work's lost, but Eusebius uses him as a principal source when he gives his own description of the rain miracle here. And he essentially claims that Christian soldiers who were with Marcus began praying, and that it was due to their intercessions to the Christian God that the Roman army was saved. After Apollinaris, and possibly dependent on him, Tertullian combines the story with the idea that Marcus Aurelius sent a letter to the Senate testifying to this occurrence. Tertullian writes, "But we produce, on the contrary, a protector among the superior emperors, if the letters of Marcus Aurelius, that most worthy emperor, are consulted, in which he gives witness that the German drought was dispelled by the rains procured through the prayers of Christian soldiers." Tertullian clearly didn't possess this letter, despite the claims of some scholars, or else he certainly would have quoted from it. We do possess a supposed letter of Marcus Aurelius to the Senate on this topic, which records exactly that same story, that there were Christians serving with him. And at the beginning of the battle, they began praying. Water poured down from the heavens, a withering hail scattered the enemies, and immediately we recognize the presence of God, a God unconquerable and indestructible. Now, obviously, this letter is a forgery, not least because Marcus Aurelius's column indicates that Marcus was not personally with the army when the rain miracle occurred, but it's also a late forgery. Freudenberger has shown that the text of that letter is dependent on Galerius's Edict of Toleration, which was published in 311 AD. And this letter may actually have been written as late as Julian's reign in the late 4th century. But this too is instructive, showing the longevity of the tradition. We see here then that Christians not simply accepted the necessity of violence on the Roman borders, but actually sought to manufacture their own appropriately spiritualized military glory out of the defeat of Rome's barbarian enemies. The struggle to interpret this event in the right way, with the emperor, pagan authors, and Christians all trying to present their own interpretations, suggests the value that could be generated by writing about war in the right way. And this was one battle that even the Irenic Christians couldn't hold back from. So what does the evidence in this section suggest overall about the ways that early Christians wrote about war and peace in the Roman world? Well, firstly, when ancient Christians wrote about war, it was mainly because it served an internal purpose. War was marshaled when someone had a point to prove. Secondly, and relatedly, despite some of the high-minded sentiment we explored in section 1, there was no getting away from the fact that the ancient Mediterranean was a society saturated by violence and warfare and by images thereof. That meant that military glory and military defeat were natural topics for authors to reach for, but it also meant that any universal worldview, which Christianity claimed to be, would have been conspicuously incomplete and unsatisfactory if it had not been able to incorporate warfare into its overall scheme. Finally, and like section 1, we see that this produced again a highly malleable and rhetorical exposition of warfare. Christians were able to interpret in almost the same breath both the general peace of the Roman Empire and the wars which undeniably still occurred as irrefutable proof of God's plan. The question behind this seminar series is, why do people write about war? From this evidence, it almost appears as if war, as a discrete concept, didn't matter that much to the ancients. They didn't write about war for war's sake. So we've moved from attitudes to a real, concrete Roman army to theological understandings of human warfare. And now finally we arrive at the third of my themes, the complete spiritualization of warfare. This is a way that Christians imagine their spiritual battles against the dark forces of Satan, how these images were in communication with the real world of warfare, and how these constructions can be seen as a way of managing the trauma of the physical violence that at least some persecuted Christians, the martyrs, were subjected. To many scholars, the popular imagery of the Militia Christi, the army of Christ, has seemed incongruous with the disavowal of warfare and of military service that we've seen. But focusing on the themes that we've seen continue to resurface, warfare mobilized for identity construction, literary relationships, and rhetorical slipperiness, we should be able to see some commonalities. So again, just to briefly start with the New Testament, Jesus certainly engages in combat with a multitude of demons, and a very interesting recent book by Jesse Nichol called The Things That Make for Peace, Jesus and Eschatological Violence, argues that Jesus' battles with demons are pitched deliberately in opposition to contemporary trends in Judaism, which promoted physical violent revolution as a means to hasten God's day of judgment. Factors, Nichol believes, which led Judea into the Maccabean revolt, as well as the markedly less successful rebellions under the Roman Empire. Jesus' spiritual violence against demons is thus shown as the proper combat arena for Christians. And another recent book by Gabriella Ghelardini argues something similar, making the case that Jesus' apostles are presented as generals, his followers as an army, and makes a striking claim that 32% of the Lexemes in Mark have warlike meanings. On this view, Mark's gospel guarantees the ultimate victory of Christ as a spiritual warrior, compared against the utter failure of the Jewish revolt. But in terms of the later development of images of spiritual warfare, it's Paul who represents the locus classicus. At several points, Paul refers to his co-workers as fellow soldiers, sostratiotai. In 2 Corinthians, Paul explicitly engages with the idea of spiritual warfare, arguing that Christians do not wage war by the flesh, but with the spirit. But it's Ephesians chapter 6, which gives us our most influential formulation. Paul says, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God and stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with a breastplate of justice in place, with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. This passage is in direct conversation with similar constructions in the Septuagint. For example, from Isaiah chapter 59, the Lord put on righteousness as his breastplate and the helmet of salvation on his head. And there's similar images in the Book of Wisdom as well. Paul's metaphorical usage of the theme of spiritual combat is thus highly indebted to the Hellenistic, the Jewish Hellenistic intellectual world of the Septuagint, and does not directly respond to military themes in his own day. But we'll see how this theme develops, and while the Septuagint remains an important referent, these images do actually become kind of more Romanized as time goes on. Written perhaps in the 90s AD, the letter of the Roman Church to the Corinthians, known as 1 Clement, introduces the concept of military desertion in a spiritual context, arguing that we should not be deserters from God's will. And then chapter 37 uses Paul's idea of soldiers under Christ and the idea of a physical army to exhort the Corinthian church to discipline under its bishop. Let us serve as soldiers, brothers. Let us consider the soldiers who serve under our commanders, how precisely, how readily, how obediently they execute orders. Not all are prefects, eparchoi, or tribunes, chiliarchoi, or centurions, hectacontarchoi, or commanders of 50, pentektontarchoi, but each in his own rank executes the orders given by the king and the commanders, hegomenes. Now, because of the common translations of these words, prefects, tribunes, centurions, etc., it looks like Clement is here clearly referring to the Roman army. But like Paul, Clement's army is the army of the Septuagint. Eparchos for leader, chiliarchos for commander of 1,000, hectacontarchos for commander of 100 are all very common terms used in the Septuagint describing the armies of Israel. See, for example, Exodus chapter 18, verse 21. And the dead giveaway here is Clement's use of pentacontarchos. Clement must have been very bookish indeed if he didn't know that there were no commanders of 50 among the Romans. But this, again, is a very common term in the Septuagint. Clement's spiritual army is therefore very much a literary one. Ignatius gives us our first sight of a more Romanized spiritual army. In the early 2nd century, this bishop of Antioch was arrested, taken to Rome for trial, and presumably executed. While traveling under arrest through Asia Minor, he wrote a number of letters to Christian communities in the area, including his Epistle to Polycarp, addressed to the Bishop of Smyrna. This letter covers the same themes as 1 Clement, pay respects to your bishop, stuff like that. And he argues, please the one whom you serve as soldiers, from whom you receive your wages. Let none of you be found a desertor. Let your baptism serve as a shield, faith as a helmet, love as a spear, endurance as armor. Let your deeds be your deposits, ta deposita, in order that you may eventually receive the savings, ta akepta, that are due to you. Most striking here is the Greek-speaking bishop's conspicuous use of 3 Latin terms in quick succession, desertor, deposita, akepta. More than this, the idea of depositing savings which are received on honourable discharge corresponds exactly to the practice in the Roman army of a set sum of a soldier's salary being kept back in the unit's treasury, paid out when service was completed. Clearly then, Ignatius' formulation here depends on contact with actual Roman soldiers. It's sometimes been suggested that this relates to his time with the unit of soldiers who were escorting him to Rome, which is possible, but we might also remember Tacitus' comment about the extreme closeness between the citizens and the soldiers at Antioch. So there's definitely a possibility that his familiarity with Latin military terms and procedure, incorporated into his vision of the spiritual army, comes from contact with the military community at Antioch. And perhaps even at this early stage, there were some Christian legionaries, or some Christians amongst the legionaries stationed in the city. Staying with Greek authors for now then, it's Origen, again, writing in the 3rd century, who gives us our most systematic exposition of spiritual warfare. We've already seen that Origen doesn't deny Celsus's implication that Christians do not serve in the army. He argues instead that Christians render a spiritual help to the emperors more important than any military service. The more pious a man is, the more effective he is at helping the emperors, Origen argues, more so than the soldiers who go out into the lines and kill all the enemy troops they can. We who by our prayers destroy all demons which stir up wars, violate oaths, and disturb the peace, are of more help to the emperors than those who seem to be doing the fighting. And he says, we do not serve in the army, even if he presses for this, yet we still are fighting for him and composing a special army of piety through our intercessions to God. Here, Origen, reusing some of Paul's imagery, connects the idea of Christians as spiritual battlers of demons to a real-world military purpose. If it's the foul demons who stir up mankind and pit the nations against each other, the flip side of the idea that Augustus was divinely ordained to bring peace to the world, then Christian spiritual warfare against demons can render actual military help to Rome with no violence against humans necessary. Origen, however, had to deal with a difficult exegetical problem. Because if warfare was caused by demons and the people of God couldn't kill, then how could the warfare which saturated the pages of the Hebrew Bible be explained? This was a problem with high stakes in the identity negotiation of early Christians, as with other issues we've seen, because there were in this period a very large number of Christians of varying allegiances who denied that Yahweh, the God of the Jews, or the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, was fundamentally a warrior God, was the same as the father of the New Testament. All of the authors we've looked at here were, at least on this point, expounders of what we would now consider the orthodox view. But in this period, it was far from clear that this argument would win the day. Authors like Justin, Tertullian, and Origen had a real fight on their hands to present the case that the Hebrew Bible was relevant at all to Christians. And Matthias den Dulk has argued that it was this debate, as much as any disagreement with contemporary Jews, that motivated the need to demonstrate the ways in which Jesus' messiahship was predicted in Jewish scripture. The first part of Origen's response to this problem was an argument of necessity. Looking back at the Old Testament period, he argues, if you took away from the Jews of that time, who had their own political life and country, the power to go out against their enemies and fight for their traditional customs and to take life, the inevitable consequence would have been their complete and utter destruction when their enemies attacked the nation. Again, we see that rhetorical malleability and the way that political identity determines the way war is written about. Imagining himself as an independent state, Origen has no problems justifying warfare. The second part of Origen's response was to spiritualize the message of warfare in the Hebrew Bible for the purposes of Christian exegesis. In his homilies on Joshua, Origen declares, unless those physical wars bore the figure of spiritual wars, I do not think the books of Jewish history would have been handed down by the apostles to the disciples of Christ who came to teach peace. Knowing that we do not have to wage physical wars, but that the struggles of the soul have to be exerted against spiritual adversaries, the apostle, that's Paul, just as a military leader, gives an order to the soldiers of Christ, saying, put on the armor of God. And in order for us to have examples of these spiritual wars from deeds of old, he wanted those narratives of exploits to be recited to us in church. We may consider, by means of those nations that fought visibly against physical Israel, how great are the swarms of opposing powers from among the spiritual races that stir up wars against the Lord's church, which is the true Israel. Just like physical forces kill with the sword, spiritual forces kill the soul with sin. On this view, the physical warfare of ancient Israel, that ancient Israel waged against its enemies, was simply a dry run for the spiritual conflict against the forces of darkness, which Christians will lead. This is developed further in his homilies on Numbers, but I will, a little bit behind time, so I will skip some of this. I'll just quote one final section here. Yeah, so he argues, when you arm yourself with weapons such as these, Paul's spiritual weapons again, and follow the general Jesus, you will not fear these giants, for you'll see how Jesus will subject them to himself. And just as the fathers trampled on the necks of the nations, so also will you trample on the backs of the demons. Armed solely with faith in Christ and with his word, you will overcome giants and legions of demons. So in these passages, Origen is finding a way to incorporate the narratives of military exploit from the Hebrew Bible into a Christian worldview, which is essential for the maintenance of the view that Yahweh is the Christian father, and that Christ was both his son and the Messiah that was promised in the Jewish scriptures. But his formulation here also articulates the way that Christianity has superseded Judaism. The juxtaposition of physical and spiritual action asserts a link to the Jewish past, but also emphasizes the fact that Christianity has evolved out of this physical straitjacket towards the true heavenly Jerusalem, while the physical Jewish Jerusalem has suffered physical destruction. The mantle of the people of God has passed to those who recognize the Messiah. The interplay between physical and spiritual war thus goes to the heart of the most pressing Christian identity needs of the 2nd and 3rd century. And the final topic, which I'll go quite quickly through. So Tertullian adopts the motif of spiritual combat in his short treatise to the Martyrs, which demonstrates some examples of the Romanizing tendency of this imagery, as well as the use it increasingly begins to serve, which is the description of the martyr's struggle against physical hardships. Here he's essentially comparing the martyr's struggle to the physical exertions that a soldier needs to undertake in the camp, which is a far cry from his negative description of idolatrous camp duties in the texts we saw earlier. We'll skip that. And finally, Cyprian, who was the Bishop of Carthage half a century after Tertullian wrote and was deeply influenced by him, adopted this martyrological usage of the Militia Christi imagery. His letters concern the Decian persecution and its aftermath. Though he himself went into hiding during this first empire-wide persecution of Christians, many Christians were tortured, condemned, imprisoned, exiled, and some killed. After Cyprian returned to his episcopacy, he had to contend with the authority of those who had risked death for their religion, and he accepted that they'd won a great spiritual victory. In his 10th epistle, he positively compares those he's addressing to those who have suffered torture and imprisonment with those who have only suffered exile. Your present confession is so much more brilliant and greater in honor as it is braver in suffering. The combat has increased. The glory of the combatants has also increased. You are not kept back from the conflict by fear of tortures, but by the very tortures themselves, you are more stirred up for the conflict. Brave and firm, you have gone forth with manifest loyalty to the battle of the greatest struggle. For him, the martyrs are the perfect examples of the divine warriors Paul described. It says they were stripped of worldly weapons, but believing they were armed with the arms of faith. The juxtaposition of the physical struggle, which is all the Roman judges can inflict, and the spiritual battle in which the Christians will inevitably be victorious, is explicitly made by an anecdote Cyprian records about a particular martyr. A voice filled with the Holy Spirit broke forth from the lips of the martyr when the most blessed Mappalicus said to the proconsul in the midst of his torments, "Tomorrow you will see the combat." This combat, therefore, foretold formerly by the prophets, engaged in by the Lord, carried on by the apostles, Mappalicus promised again to the proconsul. If Christians, therefore, will be victorious in their spiritual combat against the forces of darkness, then it follows that wicked persecutors, spurred on by the demons, will inevitably be defeated and cast into the abyss with Satan. Spiritual warfare is thus hardly without its human casualties. He finishes with an exhortation. If the line of battle has called you, fight bravely, struggle constantly, knowing that you are fighting under the eyes of God who is present. He himself joins battle. He himself, in the contest of our struggle, both crowns and is likewise crowned. It's hard here to avoid the image of the brave Roman soldier fighting all the more valiantly under the eyes of his commander, hoping to win the prizes of battle. Traditionally, like the martyr's reward, a crown. There's a number of martyr texts that could be quoted to flesh out this angle, but obviously I don't have time to go into them here. But what we've seen, though, is that through the image of spiritual combat, with a genealogy traceable back to Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, undeniably Romanized, activating concepts like labor, virtus, valor, disciplina, etc., again put to the purposes of identity construction. Whereas Origen, well, unlike Origen, Cyprian is unconcerned about settling the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, nor is he even really responding to Jesus and Paul's world of exorcisms. Here, the spiritual army is marshalled in support of an image of Christians persecuted by the world, and spiritual combat is a guarantee of the inevitable Christian victory. The enemy's attacks can only be physical and therefore can be endured, but the persecutor's defeat on the spiritual plane grants eternal life to the faithful and destruction to the wicked. Such ideas can be seen to deconstruct Roman power on a literary level, but on a psychological level, Maureen Tilley has argued that they may have given Christian martyrs and confessors the mental tools to endure the physical horrors they faced. So to wrap everything up, we've looked at similar, sometimes identical material in three quite different ways in order to think about how early Christians wrote about war. For me, the most important takeaway is an answer to the question, why do people write about war? And we thought about this question last week, especially trying to work out why, even people who experience warfare sometimes don't write about it, and what therefore motivates those writings which are made. And judging from the material we've seen today, the answer is not war. That is, in not one of the texts we've seen today was anyone really trying to write about war for its own sake. In every single passage, war is a theme that is being mobilized to serve a purpose, as a rule for the construction of identity. Whether that was to paint an image of Christians as separated from the world, or conversely as full participants in it, or as an image of Christians as linked with but superior to Judaism, or finally as the physically afflicted martyrs whose eternal victory was assured. Building into this and intimately connected with it is the fact that warfare was everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. It was something that states did and were expected to do. It was much more normal than it was for us, even in the relatively peaceable Roman Empire. So much so that the question that modern minds formulate, like why write about war, may even be a little anachronistic. In a context in which war and images of war were everywhere, it's perhaps unsurprising that war was rarely explicitly theorized. Conversely, if war was an accepted aspect of political life, then it was exactly their exclusion from political life that allowed some Christians to write about a world without war. But we can't see them as pacifist statements in the modern sense, and they were unsustainable principles that inevitably fractured at the slightest hint of Christian statehood. In other words, writing war was in many ways a reflection of the political identity of the author. It corresponded to the way the author understood their position in the ancient Mediterranean web of power relations. That's why no Christian thinker in this period formulates anything quite like, for example, Cicero's just war theory, and why it takes Augustine, a Christian who understood his place in the Roman Empire quite differently from anyone we've looked at today, to do so. At the same time, I'm not suggesting that those theories lack their rhetorical elements. We've also seen how disconnected war writing can be from the real world. Many of the wars and armies we've looked at were the armies of books, patchworks of literary references, mainly biblical in the material we've looked at today, but not exclusively so. Of course, that's not to say that real-world images don't find their ways into these texts. We've seen, Roman features creep into the Christian spiritual army, but this serves as another reminder, which should now be unsurprising, that issues of literary representation and intertextuality are as important to the way people wrote about war in antiquity as the way that war was actually practiced. So to sum it up in a sentence, on this evidence, we've repeatedly seen that war writing in antiquity was rhetorical, malleable, literary, and above all, political. Thank you very much.